Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates running for Boston City Council in the preliminary election on Tuesday, September 24th. Our guest is a councilor at large running for re-election. We'd like to welcome Michelle Wu. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with what you were doing earlier today, Councilor. You were at the big rally here, the climate strike in City Hall Plaza. First of all, what made you want to take part in this?
This is such an urgent issue for our future, and we know that every major movement that has achieved some measure of progress for our country has been led by young people. So when we see tens of thousands of young people standing up, I'm there to follow their lead. And I was really proud to be on City Hall Plaza with them.
Now, when you see yourself trying to make a difference on climate change in the city of Boston, the mayor has done some things, other councilors have done some things. What's the most important thing you would say that you've done?
We, as a society, need to change every part of how we're thinking about climate and climate justice. So at the city level, a lot of that is setting the example. So whether it's pushing for public transportation that is reliable and accessible, or pushing the city to adopt community choice energy, switching to a higher sourcing of renewable energy, or an ordinance that we passed that incorporates food justice principles into our Boston Public School food purchasing. I think we've seen a range of activity. It just needs to be so much more urgent and at a greater scale.
You've gotten some attention for dramatizing the transportation issue, but maybe less dramatically. You've also done some homework, or at least you've had your staff people working on things, let's say passes for students. Tell us a little bit about that.
Last summer, one of the projects in my office was to think about how youth across the city access transportation. And so we conducted hundreds of interviews with high school age students living in Boston, just to understand how are they getting around, what did they need to get to, what were some of the barriers and experiences. And we had a couple main takeaways, but one of the biggest was that the way that Boston Public Schools was giving out passes to be able to ride the T for free in some ways was arbitrarily putting one group of students as unable to access any transportation to not just to school, but to after school activities, internships, etc., based on how far they lived. The cost and the reliability of the T came up again and again and again as the main barrier. And we also learned that the students were having such a difficult experience with public transit that when asked what did they envision themselves doing when they had freedom and a job and a choice, many of them said they were hoping to drive, right? So that is how we are investing in our public transit system now, is not just about getting people to work, but also shaping the preferences and the plans for young people who we need to be leading the charge in taking the T and improving it.
Charging for resident parking stickers, does that change behavior, or is there maybe another goal that you had in mind with that?
We know that whenever even a modest fee is attached to resident parking, that changes how people think about on-street parking, so that it's no longer an unlimited, perceived as unlimited free car storage, and more a limited public resource that we need to manage. When you think about managing that better, you can do other things with it too, like add a visitor parking pass that I know many residents in neighborhoods across the city want. The details can be worked out of any piece of legislation, but the bottom line is that we know a lot of traffic, a significant percentage of traffic, comes from cars circling around to find parking, including resident parking. So we need to have the conversation about how to fix that.
Free MBTA, I think hardly anybody thinks that's going to happen at face value anytime soon, but you put something into play. What do you think was the result of that? In
calling for the MBTA's fare hikes to be stopped, not only did we have some wins, right? So initially it was an across-the-board fare hike that was proposed, and after a big push to say we actually don't want fare hikes, we want to go in the other direction, the T did roll back the proposal, so they shielded some of the most vulnerable riders, bus riders, seniors, and youth. And in the larger way, when you start putting big aspirational ideas on the table, it changes what's possible. So look at Lawrence. Just a couple weeks ago, the city of Lawrence announced that they were making all bus transportation through Lawrence free. 3 bus lines for 2 years to think about and to empower residents to get to opportunities, because we'd started having this conversation in Boston.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu. Councilor, now that there has been a bribery charge involving a zoning decision, there's a big spotlight on that. But even earlier than that, you were talking about the system and why it needs to change. What do you have in mind about that?
When we have a system where development happens through special approvals and exceptions, and there is a lack of clear, consistent rules that are applied across the board, it leads to the possibility for those with influence to drive the progress. And we know that, certainly we need to have high standards and ethical behavior all around in City Hall and from every public servant, but this is more than just about one instance of rogue criminal behavior. The system is driven by relationships and by influence, because every decision has to come before the board, has to have certain variances and negotiations with the community and other people who weigh in. That's not a system that is fair, that is efficient, and that leads to sustainable outcomes for the city.
Isn't this maybe also about the makeup of the people who make those decisions? A lot of them are from fields that want more growth. So I guess, isn't that going to lead to more growth?
I think we certainly need to have a conversation about how the seats on the Zoning Board of Appeals are allocated. There are seats designated, for example, for the real estate industry and for certain other parts of the system that have a financial stake in development, but not a seat, for example, for an affordable housing advocate or a community advocate in certain ways. But the larger point is that we shouldn't see the majority of decisions, de facto policy and planning, happening through the appeals process. Appeals should be relatively rare because there are clear and consistent rules that everyone knows that they need to follow.
At least until a few weeks ago, you were not the only city council candidate to have a problem with the school assignment system. Anything you'd like to see done to fix that?
Again, there are small issues and then there are the big issues. We are thrilled that my 4-year-old now has a spot in a K-1 program at the Sumner School in Rosendale. It was a little bumpy to get there, as many families experience. And so, I have plenty of ideas, and I've heard from many families who've given feedback on ways to make the assignment system more efficient and more equitable and more convenient. Getting it online, for example, to have both options for people who can do it online and in person for people who might not have access to internet. But the big picture is that our assignment system and our lottery shouldn't be so high stakes. It shouldn't be that you either win the lottery or you lose, and it's a difference between thousands of dollars for your family for that year, between an option that you feel comfortable with versus one that you don't. We are losing families from the system because of the unpredictability and because of this high stakes situation. If we had quality seats convenient to where families needed them, a lottery to decide between multiple great options is a very different lottery than what we have now.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu.